beginning? Where's Lisa gone?
I'm here. I think that's an
All right.
idea.
Oh, there she is.
Should we think about making a start?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Shall I, do I give my spiel?
Yes. You're on.
Okay. Are the others muted? Because I can hear somebody. I can hear someone talking.
Yeah, I can too.
There we are.
Okay. Right. Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to Writers in Kyoto Zoom event. Thank you very much for participating. And this actually marks the beginning of our 6th year of activity. So for the past 5 years, we've had all kinds of events like lunch talk, dinner talk, words and music, performances. We've done an anthology, we've run a competition, we've run the website. We've had many different activities, but we've never had a Zoom event. So this is our very first, and it'll be interesting to see how it goes. And in the future, if it works, we may be able to develop this further, because it's nice to welcome members in Australia, like Jan. We do have members in America as well. We have in Canada, Catherine Pawasarat. We've also got one member at the moment in Bangkok, not here, and somebody stranded in Malaysia. And even within Japan, we have a member in Himeji, one in Seto Naikai, of course, Amy, one in Osaka, Shiga-ken, and even one in enemy territory in Kanto with Mark in Kamakura. So it's a very nice way of bringing the members together, because although we're writers in Kyoto, not everybody is physically in Kyoto. We accept people whose heart is in Kyoto as well. So I think this has got great potential for the future. Let's see how it works today. This is also the beginning of our membership drive, or it's part during our membership drive in May. The end of May will be our new membership for the coming year. So if you haven't already renewed, please do so by next week, because in June we'll be drawing up new membership lists and silently dropping all those who haven't paid. So please make an effort to pay up before the end of this month. And we do have some appetizing events for you during the coming year, beginning with a new anthology, our 4th anthology, kindly edited by Rebecca Ottawa. We also have a virtual Gion Matsuri in July. We have, by popular request, the return of Robert Wittkamp, who will be displaying his erudition about Japanese mythology in October. We have At Home with Malcolm Ledger in November, and anyone who's seen pictures of his house will know that that's going to be something very special indeed. We have in the works a possible collaboration with artists in Kyoto, and we're also hoping to have a very special geisha event. And I'm pleased to say that just yesterday, I got acceptance in principle from Michael Hoffman, and another Japan Times columnist, of course, and he will be speaking to us sometime over the coming year, but that's not fixed yet. So we've got an exciting program lined up, and it just remains for me to say thank you to various people who've kept WIC in progress this year. These include Paul Carty, our treasurer and co-chair, Karen Lee Tawarayama, who very efficiently run the competition yet again, Rebecca Ottawa, who's taking over the anthology from Jan Williams, who kindly prepared a bunch of notes to pass on for the next anthology editor. We also have Amy, of course, our social manager, our publicity manager and social media manager, and Mayumi Kawaharada, who's our Japanese liaison. And Robert Yellin, I have to give special thanks to for sponsoring the prize for the competition, the local prize, and offering his new house as a possible venue for our meetings. So before I go on, I think Mark is waving.
Listen, there's a lot of noise and chatter. If people turn their Zoom to mute, and then I'm going to turn mine to mute, and you'll see a little icon appear.
Right, I thought.
And that'll cut out all the chatter. When you want to talk, then unmute yourself. Okay, that's all.
Right, thank you. And finally, a word of thanks to the 3 people that have made today possible. To Jeff Kingston, who's agreed to speak to us, to Amy Chavez, who's agreed to do the interview for us, and Lisa Wilcott, who's organizing and managing this Zoom session. Thank you to all 3. Before we get on with the interview, I think Lisa has a couple of housekeeping items. Is that right?
I do indeed. Oh, hello everyone. I am manning the Zoom desk here. And so it was on my agenda to ask everyone to please mute themselves when not speaking, but we needed that ahead of time. So thank you very much, Mark. And at any rate, and if you haven't found it yet, in the bottom left-hand corner, there's the mute button. It's a toggle. You switch on, switch off. Also next to that is the video button. If your internet gets slowed down during the course of the afternoon, if you stop your video, that might help things speed up on your end. So if you're in the swamp there, that's a good trick. Let's see, for questions today, we have a couple of different ways we'll go about it. If you would like to type in a question into the chat function as we're going along, if there's a moment then to pause, we may take some questions along the way. Or Amy and Jeff may decide before leaving one topic for another one that we'll pause and take questions then. Another way to sort of get in the queue for a question is to use the raise your hand function. So if you should be in participants, if you click participants at the bottom, after that, that should take you to finding that raise your hand button. I think it's there. I don't actually see it on mine since the host doesn't have that function.
I see it.
Yeah, see it.
All right. Okay, good. Or you can raise your hand the old-fashioned way. And we will do the old-fashioned questions and answers at the end. Let's see. Amy has told me that there's an alarm of some sort that's going to sound at 5 o'clock. So if she's speaking at the moment and her audio is on, we're going to hear that. Just to let you know, that might be happening. And I think that's all I had for you. Any technical questions before we get underway? All right, I am going to turn it over to you, Amy. Go ahead.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for showing up on Zoom, and thanks to Jeff. I guess I need to introduce Jeff Kingston, even though he needs no introduction. But Jeff is the Director of Asian Studies at Temple University, Japan. He's also a prolific author, and some of his books are Press Freedom in Contemporary Japan, Japan Politics from 1945 to Present, Nationalism in Asia, History since 1945. And most people will know Jeff, however, from his, I think, from his counterpoint column in the Japan Times. He's been writing for the Japan Times since 1988 and until 2017. And so welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. Nice to meet you. I know I've seen your column for many years in the Japan Times, so nice to meet you. It's also nice to know about this group because our Asian Studies major at Temple has just been revamped, and the main campus has inserted a requirement course called Writing the City. And we're supposed to choose 3 different cities, and so it'd be interesting to find out more about the writings on Kyoto as possibly one of those cities, although I'm not teaching that course right now, but I may do so in the future. Regarding the Japan Times, yeah, I think that just before I was going to hit my 30th year anniversary, when they probably would have to give me a gold watch, they basically terminated my column. And when I started at the Japan Times in 1988, I basically wrote book reviews. And I wrote book reviews up until, I don't know, 2015 or so. And probably other than Donald Ritchie, I've written more book reviews than anybody else at the Japan Times. And the best part about doing that is you meet a lot of people, well, particularly if they like the review. And so I've made a lot of friendships and probably a few enemies during that period. Then I was also doing feature pieces, the Time Out on Sundays. And so there I would be writing about, I take trips to, say, Kyrgyzstan or to Tamil Nadu or Sri Lanka or Cambodia, things about the Battle of Okinawa. And so I'd write these feature pieces. And then the editor of that column, Andrew Kershaw, then said, well, Roger Pulvers is going to give up the counterpoint column. I think he'd been writing it for 8 years, and asked if I would do it. And rashly, I said, sure, why not? And not realizing that a weekly column is a lot of work. But anyway, I did that and enjoyed it, learned a lot. And I never had any editorial interference up until June of 2017. I could write what I want. Nobody tried to change the analysis or the content in any particular way. And then when there was a new ownership from the middle of 2017, first time I got a yellow card was right on Friday night. Suddenly I get this message, oh, the editor has trouble with your column. You have to change this, this, this. And so we managed to negotiate a rather modest set of changes, which didn't really affect the column significantly, but it was like, aha. And earlier in the year, I'd gotten a warning from a good friend who's well connected, said, yeah, watch out, these new owners, it's going to change the whole game, and you're in their sights, because he had attended a meeting of important LDP government people in which the Japan Times was singled out as a problem to solve, because under Prime Minister Abe, they greatly increased their budget for public diplomacy, like they tripled it. And so their worry was that all this money they're spending on trying to burnish Japan's image was being undone by these nattering nabobs and negativity in the Japan Times. And Japan Times may have a tiny circulation, but it punches above its weight in the internet. Because when people Google, about Japan, they often will get on a Japan Times story. And so I think one of the reasons why they decided to help facilitate a change in ownership was to deal with the problem the Japan Times represented. So anyway, after that yellow card incident in June, there was another small problem in July. And then in early August, the Asahi ran a very lengthy interview with me about press freedom in Japan. And it was quite critical, as is the book that I edited. And the next week, suddenly out of the blue, I get this email saying, well, we're terminating your column, and we need to use the space for something else. And a friend of mine who had been in the room when the decision was made actually told me that it had nothing to do with space. It all had to do with politics. But that was sort of a he said, she said sort of situation. And, I sort of knew it was coming, and it happened. But, I dropped it after that. And, I had a lot of extra free time. And so I've been writing and editing lots of books since then. But then last year ago, in January 2019, the Reuters got a hold of a tape of a meeting that the editor, Mizuno, had with the staff, because there was a lot of unhappiness. They had introduced new sort of Weasley wording about the comfort woman and forced labor. And the staff was very unhappy. They thought it was embarrassing. And in the discussion and explanation, somebody apparently asked, why do they axe, they purge several columnists like Hugh Cortazzi, Jiro Yamaguchi, me, Pavan Chachavallampong, and I think Davido might have been purged or semi-purged as well. So people who were known to be fairly critical of the Abe administration were basically shown the exit. So in the tape, it has Mizuno saying, well, in exchange for firing, Kingston, we got a lot more government advertising, and we got an exclusive interview with Abe. So it went from being a he said, she said thing to the editor on tape. So that caused a bit of a kerfuffle, and this past January, basically he was forced to resign, and as of March, he left the company. So the thing is, I still subscribe to the Japan Times. I think they have a lot of really good reporters. I'm sorry that Reiji Yoshida took the early retirement option. I'm also sorry that it's only 10 pages most days a week now. It used to be 14, so they really slimmed down. So things are changing, and none of the staff got bonuses in December. So apparently, despite the increase in government ad revenue, something's wrong in terms of their revenues. And so I think a lot of the staff are demoralized. They had an offer of early retirement, and they promised to have further cuts this year. And I think that they hoped that the Olympics would give them a new lease on life, but obviously that hasn't happened. So that's basically the Japan Times saga. And I find no problem of other outlets to publish my my op-eds. My wife was really concerned that if I didn't have this weekly chance to vet my spleen, I would start ranting around, at the television or something. But that hasn't happened. So anyway, all good there. So any questions about the Purge?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I've also heard that there was a bit of a walkout as well. And because people who were not happy with the way the editorial directional changes. And I also, even though I don't write anything political or anything controversial, I also have been subject to certain edits, and everything has to be, vetted now, and your idea has to go in and get approved with an editorial board and this and that. And so it's just really a hassle to even write an article. And then, of course, the editors are all very busy, and they might not get back to you when you need to have an answer for something and get it in. So I think it hasn't been a very smooth transition for many people at the Japan Times. I was wondering how directly related to the Abe administration this is, because also NHK went through a purge, as well as some other places. So it's no secret. What do you think about that?
Well, I think I can't really go into great detail, but people who know pretty closely link it to the Abe administration, and people who are on Team Abe were involved in this transition and the naming of the new editor, Mizuno. So yeah, I think that maybe this will be an example of sontaku, people doing what they think is desired without necessarily being asked to do it. But I have it on good authority that one of the deputy prime ministers, actually in a public forum, did say something had to be done about the Japan Times, and then 6 months later, that was done. So,
Well, this is a great lead into press freedom, isn't it? And how is this going to change the Japan Times? And the great thing about the Japan Times is that it was really the only paper that didn't have a Japanese version. And we were all foreigners and giving our opinions, which is what made it so lively, because there's lots of experience behind each writer because they aren't Japanese. So, it was a very nice place to read those views.
Well, for me, the op-eds now, the columns they run, I don't know if you read them, but I certainly don't. They're pretty boring. Nobody is doing op-eds about domestic policies, government policies, Abe's policies. It's essentially a lot of, wonkish stuff on foreign policy issues, a lot on China. There's one column that's basically, boosting Abenomics, boosting Japan type thing. So I think that the focus of the op-eds has changed. I mean, I was accused of writing every week about Abe, which isn't actually true. I did about a third of my columns on the rest of Asia. I did a lot on nuclear power, which I guess in some ways relates to Abe, but I did a lot on historical revisionism. You don't see any of that coverage anymore. Regarding the press freedom, the interesting thing is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs sees it as its duty to admonish anybody who criticizes the Abe government, as if you criticize Abe, it means you're a Japan basher. Whereas I know a lot of people who like Japan quite a lot, but are very critical of Abe. Which actually is something like 75% of the Japanese people in a recent poll said that his crisis management of the pandemic has been disastrous. So it's not like, you can it's this sort of ad hominem attack that I found very objectionable. But also reporters tell me that they're warned not to interview people like Koichi Nakano or me because we're unreliable. And this came from the embassy in Washington instructing the international media handler here in Tokyo to lobby journalists not to interview us because we're unreliable. Instead, they suggested this guy who's a hack for hire who lives in Chiang Mai who really knows nothing at all about Japan, but he has the right views on comfort women and forced labor. So actually, when I got fired, the next week, ironically, I was at a conference in Lisbon, and I was on the panel on press freedom with Koichi Nakano. And about an hour beforehand, Anna Fifield from the Washington Post sent us an email that, I've been chastised again by Guy Musho for quoting you guys. You're always getting me in trouble. So, of course, we had a very lively session talking about the Japan Times Purge, about how the government goes after its critics. One of the interesting things, if you look in the recent pandemic countermeasures stimulus package the Abe administration recently introduced, there is an allocation of like 20 million bucks to use AI by the Gaimusho to track foreign critics of Japan, of Abe, and to somehow correct their views. So, they're not sort of sitting back. I mean, they are much more aggressive on trying to shape the narrative. And so it's not like, spin doctors are suddenly new in Japan, but the pressure the Abe administration has put on the press has been amazing. As you noted earlier, Amy, two prominent newscasters at NHK were ousted, others at TBS, Asahi TV. So early on, the Abe administration really sent a warning shot over the bow of the press, like, you cross us and this is what's going to happen. And because in Japan, there's access journalism, meaning that, essentially you're not doing investigative reporting, you're relying on your well-placed sources to give you information and tidbits. So people here worry that if they offend anybody, their access will be cut. Now, if you read, David Kay did a report for the United Nations on press freedom in Japan, and he conducted an interview like 60 different Japanese journalists. Only one would put their name down. And he asked them how come they were reluctant. And it turns out that they don't think their editors will have their back. That editors are very conscious of not wanting to step on powerful toes. And so they're the ones who actually are pulling punches, and they are forcing the reporters, to basically hold back, or they are cutting or censoring, self-censoring their articles. So I think the state of press freedom in Japan is problematic. I mean, certainly there are worse places where you end up in jail, you get killed, whatever. But clearly there has been a much more aggressive approach to the press here. There was a suggestion among the LDP young members to actually lobby companies to stop advertising with various newspapers as a way to punish them. They're particularly upset about the newspapers in Okinawa that were critical about the Abe government's ignoring the popular referendum and public sentiment against the building of a new base in Hanako. But anyway, I'll leave it there if you have any questions.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about revisionism. And certainly that's all part of it as well, as you had mentioned earlier, the changing of the language. And now suddenly, I say suddenly, but more recently, 80s and 90s, we have issues that hadn't been brought up before, such as the comfort women and revising Article 9 for collective self-defense and such. And what has brought these things to the forefront? Because as a reader, of course, it would be very confusing if you didn't know the entire history of Asia and all the back and forth. And whenever I talk to Japanese people, they say, well, we're tired of apologizing. And this is understandable because actually there is a long history of apologizing, but things also change at the same time, and these other points are being brought up. And then, of course, there's the Yasukuni Shrine and the movement of Class A criminals over there. And so I'm wondering if you can clue us into about how all of this developed.
Yeah, about the apology issue, there is no doubt that many Japanese officials have apologized. The problem is that those apologies are almost immediately discredited, disputed, rejected by other prominent officials and leaders. So any goodwill generated by the apology is essentially immediately evaporates because they are questioned. It's very ambiguous. And so, for example, when Prime Minister Khan made a very poignant speech or statement on the 100th anniversary of Japanese colonialism in Korea. And it was very much appreciated by Koreans. I think many Japanese also thought it was an overdue apology in recognition of the deep traumas that Japan had inflicted. And so I watched NHK News that night, and they were going around doing these quick interviews with various important people. One of them was Prime Minister Abe. And he had one succinct word for Khan's statement, which was baka.
Oh.
And so I'm thinking he's a guy who speaks with authority on that topic. Well, Abe got into politics back in 1993, and the two things that motivated him was rewriting Japanese wartime history and revising the Constitution. Now, up until Hirohito died in 1989, Japanese textbooks didn't really tackle the tough issues. Essentially, they were whitewashed. And so Ienaga Saburo, famous educator, textbook writer, had long had court battles from the 1950s up until the 90s, challenging Ministry of Education's right to censor the textbooks and to remove things about Nanjing, 731, whatever. And so up until Hirohito died, I think that the history that Japanese were taught in school tended to be whitewashed. And the ministry was sort of trying to impose a collective amnesia. But once Hirohito died and the Cold War ended, suddenly, the archives began to yield their secrets. Diaries and journals were unearthed. And also at the same time, you had a democratization in Taiwan and Korea in particular. The authoritarian government under Park and subsequent military leaders had suppressed civil society, and they had sort of pushed down the history issue. But once Korea democratized, that led to a sharp politicization of history, and comfort women came forward in 1991, and then Yoshimi Yoshiaki unearthed archival documents implicating the military in the recruitment of comfort women and the maintenance of comfort stations on bases. And so this led in 1993, Miyazawa went to South Korea in front of the National Assembly there. He apologized for it. And later that year, his chief cabinet spokesman, Kono, issued the Kyoto statement, in which the government acknowledged military involvement, government knowledge of the comfort station, apologized for it, and said, we have to teach this. This is to honor these women, these victims of Japanese aggression. We have to teach this. So the Kyoto statement marks sort of like the high point, I think, of Japan coming to terms with the unappetizing history. And so 1995, from then on, many Japanese textbooks then took up the issues of the comfort woman. We had the Murayama statement, basically apologizing for the ravages of wartime Japan on Asia. And that movement of acknowledging the painful past basically, stopped in the beginning of this century. And there has been significant backsliding since then. The revisionist movement started in the mid-90s with the New Society, the Atarashi Rekshi Tsukurukai, and then also Nippon Kaigi in 1997. And these organizations, along with many others, have tried to turn back the hands of the clock to the more appetizing history that prevailed before the 90s. And they have been very aggressive in pushing a revisionist narrative of downplaying, minimizing, shifting responsibility, and justifying what Japan did in the 1930s and 1940s. And in 2007, Prime Minister Abe, in his first administration, passed a patriotic education law, which set guidelines for textbooks. And since then, there has been a significant backsliding on comfort women, such that now none of the mainstream textbooks for junior high school mention the comfort woman at all. And the one that does, which has actually testimony from a former comfort woman, was required to put a disclaimer next to her testimony saying that the survivor's testimony does not agree with the Japanese government's official policy. And all of the schools that adopted that text suddenly were inundated with, hate mail, email, snail mail, and they were targeted by these right-wing trolls, because they were essentially trying to pressure them not to adopt that particular textbook. So the revisionists, are in power, have been, under Abe since 2012, and his education minister, the first one, Hakabun Shimomura, he was also a member of Nippon Kaigi. And Nippon Kaigi's membership is only about 38,000, but they're sort of a very elite group. And 80% of Abe's cabinet members are from Nippon Kaigi. So they punch above their weight, and they're very influential. They want to basically restore the emperor system. They want to undo gender equality. They argue that Japan played a positive wartime role in liberating Asia from Western colonization, things along those lines. And so this is what the revisionists hope to do. So on the constitutional question, Abe has made no secret of the fact that he wants to revise Article 9. But the problem is, this doesn't resonate in Japanese society. Various polls show that the percentage of Japanese people who think that this is an important issue is always in single digits. It's not on that, under the refrigerator magnet to-do list. There's hardly any Japanese who think this is a really important thing to do. So back when Abe went down in 2007, he was seen to be a particularly ideological leader. And that didn't sit well with a lot of people. And then he was very dismissive about, pension records being lost. And so he led the LDP to a humiliating defeat in the upper house election. Essentially, he was shown to the door because he had become excess baggage. So in his comeback, he had to be somebody who wasn't so ideological. And so they came up, this is a Dentsu branding strategy of Abenomics, right? The 3 arrows. I'm going to lead you back. Japan is back. And so this is a way to sort of, window dressing on his ideological agenda. Well, Abenomics obviously hasn't really gone anywhere. Most households don't feel it's really benefited them. But Abe still remains intent. As you mentioned, the beginning of May, he really still wants to revise Article 9. And most people don't. So the thing is, the Constitution lays out a blueprint of how you revise the Constitution. If he wants to, go ahead. Get everybody to agree on particular wording, get it passed by 2/3 in both houses, then hold a public referendum, and you have to have a simple majority in favor of it. Abe hasn't yet gotten there. The problem is he doesn't have the support he wants. So it's not, foreigners who are against Article 9 being changed. It's the Japanese people don't want it changed. So Abe, though, has done a very sneaky, sort of underhanded way of revising the Constitution without revising it. In 2015, I don't know if you remember, he passed this collective self-defense legislation, which essentially guts Article 9. And the interesting thing is, before he passed the legislation in the Diet in the summer of 2015, he first promised America what Japan would do and these new US-Japan defense guidelines, which greatly increased Japan's military obligations to help the United States in conflicts all over the world. And, when the Japanese, and he goes to Japan, he says, well, that's not really true. We're not going to go that far. And so then, a lot of people raise the question, well, is this legislation constitutional? And so two hand-picked constitutional scholars brought into the Diet by Team Abe, and they both said the legislation is unconstitutional. It was just like, God, talk about self-inflicted wound. So then they say, well, we can't listen to pointy-head lawyers anyway. So they passed the legislation. 80% of Japanese people are against it. We had the largest demonstrations in Tokyo since the 1960s. We had several 100,000 people in front of the Diet. This is the time of the student activists, the organization called SEALs. And, Abe basically did an end around. He basically proclaimed that Article 9 allows for collective self-defense, and he passed legislation enabling Japan to meet the obligations it made under the US-Japan defense guidelines. So revision more or less has happened, but I think for a lot of Japanese, there's a symbolic importance. I think Article 9 has a sort of talismanic quality for many Japanese, and a pacifist identity has been deeply embedded in the national psyche. So it is true that the surrounding neighborhood has become a lot more dangerous over the past decade. But I don't think a lot of people believe that changing Article 9 is necessarily a positive step. But the interesting part of polling is that of the people who do support Article 9 revision, most of them don't want it to happen under Abe, because for some reason he has a trust deficit.
And at the same time, you've got China, and they are becoming more and more militaristic and asserting themselves. And I feel like that's also, something that's almost always mentioned with Article 9, when you talk to people. But I have yet to meet a Japanese person who's up for the revision of Article 9. And at the same time, it seems like in these statements, the Koizumi statement, the Murayama statement, even the Abe statement, they're all saying that they're dedicated to peace and that they don't want to go into war again. Yet I don't really see any other countries saying that either. Yet at the same time, everyone seems to be afraid that if Article 9 is changed and some of the limitations are lifted, that Japan might return to its military past.
Yeah, I think there's some people are worried that the Japanese are hardwired for militarism. I don't buy that argument. I just think the Japanese feel comfortable having, constitutional checks on power. And there is a way forward. If you want to revise the Constitution, use that to revise it. Don't do it an end around. So I think there are good reasons why Japan is concerned about a rising China. And one reason is that their relationship has not been very good. One part of that is that Japan has not really, forthrightly acknowledged their shared history. Now, you mentioned the Murayama, Koizumi, and Abe statements. Well, the Abe statement, is quite different than Murayama. Murayama's statement became sort of a mantra. Every Japanese leader would utter it. Officials would, recite it. It became sort of Japan's way of saying, we are sorry and recognize what we did to Asia at that time. Now, the interesting thing about Murayama's statement, he said, we had a mistaken national policy. He rejected sanctimonious nationalism. He also called on the government to do all it could to curb nuclear proliferation. Now, if you look at the Abe statement, it's very interesting. It's a cabinet decision. So revisionism has now become official policy. Abe said the peace and prosperity we owe today is owing to the sacrifice of the 3 million Japanese who died during the war. The Emperor Akihito, in his speech the following day, was very different, more or less echoing the Murayama statement is the peace and prosperity we enjoy now is due to the efforts of Japanese people after the war to rebuild Japan from all that war devastation. So there's maybe, it's subtle, but Abe, it says, was honoring the senseless sacrifice of wartime Japan, 31 to 45. And Akihito and Murayama were basically saying this is a mistaken national policy. The Abe government has also done nothing about nuclear non-proliferation. They actually, did not vote for the nuclear test ban that was adopted by the UN General Assembly. And when ICANN won the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts on banning nuclear tests, Abe pointedly did not have enough time to meet the leader of ICANN when made a courtesy visit to Tokyo. So I think that there are significant differences. I think Abe was very ambiguous about Japanese responsibility, hazy about what Japan inflicted on Asia. And the most interesting thing about the Abe statement was Abe said, it's time to stop apologizing. I'm not sure the perpetrator gets to decide that. And so, I think, maybe Abe went a little bit further than many of his critics expected, but, dealing with the comfort woman issue, his pain, his heart was pain thinking about all the women who suffered during wartime. Okay, that's sort of there, but a bit on the hazy side.
Yeah, and he said at the end that he thought that it's time that we get to a point where our children and the next generations don't have to apologize.
And he never apologized himself. That he invoked the apologies of his president. Oh, many people before me have apologized. Mm-hmm. But he didn't actually apologize himself. He doesn't want to be seen to apologize. And the same thing happened with the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement he had with South Korea, that this agreement was essentially conducted like a shady arms deal in smoke-filled back rooms, and suddenly announced, like a surprise, like, whoa. And the thing is, it didn't really consult Comfort Women, didn't consult many stakeholders. It was a sudden announcement. And the key thing is, Abe didn't apologize. There was a report, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, Abe, in his phone conversation with Park, apologized. But there's no recording of that phone call. no transcript or anything. So later, subsequently, Moon asked Abe to give a public apology, and he point blank refused. So he really, I guess, in terms of his base constituency, is very uncomfortable about apologizing, and he has essentially repudiated the Kono statement, and he has presided over Diet hearings in which the Kono statement was disparaged. So I think he comes up just a bit short on the contrition barometer.
Right. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. And I wanted to ask about the nuclear restarts. I mean, that's something that no one in Japan seems to want either, yet they went ahead. And is it merely just bowing to big business, or, you know, what's behind that, do you think?
Well, the nuclear village is very powerful. I mean, it's the utilities, it's the banks that lend them lots of money. It's the bureaucrats who are involved in nuclear power. It's the politicians involved with nuclear power. It's people in the media, people in academia. So the nuclear village is well placed, and they did weather the perfect storm of the Fukushima triple meltdowns. So you have triple meltdowns, you have 3 investigations into the meltdowns and the nuclear crisis, all of them damning and talking about institutionalized complacency, shoddy safety, poor maintenance, and essentially it was a man-made disaster, not a natural disaster. And eventually even TEPCO had to come clean and acknowledge, yeah, all the allegations, yeah, they're true. You know, they did come clean, you know, to their sort of credit, I guess, belatedly, because essentially they were repudiating the report that they issued in June of 2012, in which they exonerated themselves of all responsibility. So fast forwarding, 2014, the Abe administration reinstated nuclear energy into the national energy strategy and gave a vague target, 22% of Japan's electricity generating capacity will come from nuclear reactors by 2030. So that means roughly they need to have 20 reactors online at that time. As we speak, they have 9 online, and a handful more have been approved for coming back online. So there has been a remarkable nuclear renaissance, despite, as you pointed out, you know, 75 to 80% of Japanese people are against it, and a very small percentage of people are for it. Now, why are Japanese people so against nuclear energy? Well, there's an over $600 billion bill for the Fukushima cleanup, which has gotten people's attention. And that, you know, number keeps increasing. And this is going to be over the next 40 years. So, you know, right now it's 630 billion, and who knows, that's going to be much higher. So the idea that nuclear power is safe, reliable, and cheap, that was the mantra of the nuclear village when it, you know, presided over the building of 54 reactors across Japan. Obviously, that's a bad joke for, I think still, as of 2018, there were still 100,000 people displaced by the nuclear accident. So I think that there are reasons why Japanese people are leery of this nuclear renaissance, but it is big sunken investment. And a lot of people have a lot at stake in making sure that the reactors come back online. Now, we've long known it's been a bit dubious, right? I mean, there was a story broke back in 2002 that a GE employee was visiting Japan to do inspections at the TEPCO nuclear reactors. And he found out that all the repair and maintenance records have been falsified. And they just checked off the boxes and said everything's okay without actually carrying out the inspections, replacing parts or anything. So he calls up the METI, which was in charge of the Nuclear Industrial Safety Agency, and reports, well, there's this cover-up going on. Actually, they're not doing the repair maintenance. And so METI, of course, calls TEPCO and said, we got a problem. There's a whistleblower. So anyway, the story got in the media. All 17 reactors had to be shut down for repair and maintenance. And, so they went back online later on. We didn't suffer a horrible blackouts or brownouts or anything when the reactors were off. So about a week before the 311 accident, they had applied for the extension of the Fukushima reactor's operating license, which are supposed to expire after 40 years. And they did give an extension to Fukushima Daiichi, but they said, well, the problem is that, you have stress cracks in your backup generators, and you are vulnerable to a station blackout because you haven't made the changes to a defense in depth that had been recommended as far back as 1993, which TEPCO kept rejecting as too expensive. That essentially, because the backup generators were located below the reactor, between the reactor and the ocean, there was a concern that a tsunami might wipe them out. And if the main electricity source was knocked out, that would create a station blackout, and the cooling couldn't happen, and you might have meltdowns, which is exactly what happened. Right? So people have been predicting such a thing since the early 90s. And also in-house, TEPCO had a computer simulation back in 2008 say, well, this area in the past has had monster tsunami, and, we could probably, face a 15-meter tsunami. And the plant manager, Yoshida, who's the guy lionized in the media for being the guy in charge at the critical moment, the Fukushima 50. He's the guy who actually rejected building a seawall because it was too expensive, $1 billion, if they build the seawall to 15 meters. He said, the 7-meter one we have now is fine. So, the nuclear village has fended off pressures from nuclear safety watchdog agencies to upgrade safety. Now, of course, they have a totally new safety regime. It's the Nuclear Regulatory Authority. And most of the people who work there came from NISA. So it's the same people, old wine, new bottles. So when the new director came in, he said, look, we're going to make, extension of the operating license for 40 years, really hard to get, exceptional, nothing, it's not going to be easy at all. Well, every single application for extension under NRA has been approved. It's become, the default response. Oh, you want to extend your 40-year-old operating license for 20 years? Okay. So the problem is these are old plants, old technology. Safety, maybe it's being upgraded. But down there in Kansai, TEPCO, you might be aware that TEPCO has been found to have bribed local mayors and assemblies to approve nuclear power. But that's another issue. The TEPCO made an application for a couple of its plants, said, well, we haven't gotten to the replacing the electric cables yet, and we haven't done the seismic vibration test, but can we get the extension? Guess what? NRA said, sure, and don't worry. If you don't pass the seismic vibration test after we give you license, it's okay. So you're thinking like, well, have the lessons of Fukushima really been learned? And the thing is, it's not just a hardware of, upgrading the technology, the facilities. There's also the software of the people involved, human error. And do they have this inspectors with the skills necessary and political backing necessary to enforce the regulations? Because there is the issue of regulatory capture.
Okay, thank you. And I see there are some questions coming up in the chat. Did we want to take any of those, Lisa?
Let me go check.
Yes, we can do that.
Or should we just go on and take them later? I don't.
Well, it's up to you. So yeah, a couple of them are a couple steps back on the path right now. They'd be backtracking or.
Has
Okay. Well,
Asahi been neutered in some way?
Yes, we had a back to press freedoms was our first question.
I think, back in 2014, the Asahi was subject to an orchestrated attack by the Yomiuri and Sankei. Part of it was related to their reporting. They set up an investigative unit called Prometheus. And the head of that group of investigative journalists, sort of like the Boston Globe's Spotlight probe into Roman Catholic priest abuse of kids. They set up this because they were embarrassed, because the first 2 months after the nuclear meltdowns, the mass media was really missing the story. And part of it was due to the Keisha clubs. And so at that point, the Meti Keisha Club was in control of the story. Essentially, they put the lid on it. And it was only when the International Atomic Energy Agency was about to come and do an inspection, and everybody knew they were going to declare, yes, there had been a meltdown, that suddenly, the government acknowledged this. And so then the story went beyond the Meti Keisha Club, so they couldn't control the narrative. And suddenly, a lot of the mainstream media felt embarrassed by how they had been so, deferential. And so the Asahi set up this unit. They won a couple of basically like Pulitzer Prizes for their reporting, and did a really good job of unearthing information that TEPCO and the government wished they hadn't. For example, the orchestrated town hall meetings on the internet where they, coached people to weigh in support of nuclear power, things like that. So the Asahi did a lot of good reporting. And one of the things, they got a hold of a copy of Yoshida, the plant manager's testimony. And he died of esophagus cancer later on, but they had this testimony. And in it, they were reporting the chaotic conditions that prevailed during the meltdowns, and how most of the employees did a runner, and they left the Daiichi plant area and went to Daini, about 12 clicks down the road. And so essentially they were abandoning ship. And that didn't go well with the brave 50, sacrificing everything to make sure the nuclear plant was safe. It suggested that, these people sort of abandoned their post. So in his testimony, Yoshida sort of took responsibility. So, maybe the communication was garbled. Maybe I didn't make clear. I just said they should leave here. I didn't mean them to leave the Daiichi zone. I just thought maybe leave the control room area. Anyway, so they reported in a way that perhaps sensationalized it, and they got called out on that. The other thing is they got called out on stories about the comfort women from the early 1990s because they relied on the testimony of another Yoshida who happened to be a veteran, who apparently gave testimony about he was an eyewitness account of coercive recruitment of comfort women on Jeju Island. Turns out he lied. But the thing is, the Yomiuri and Sankei also reported his testimony. So it wasn't that the Asahi was alone, but anyway, they were targeted. They were also already on their back foot on Fukushima. So the Asahi basically just did a, mea culpa and said, yeah, we were wrong. And they spiked the Fukushima story, and they retracted their comfort women reporting. And, Abe, was in the diet, and after internet trolls had gone after one Asahi reporter named Uemura and said that they're going to set off a nail bomb on his university's campus if they didn't fire him, you know, and all this has gone on. And Abe's in the diet cheerleading and say, yeah, Asahi is sort of getting what they deserve. So I'd say that the Asahi had their wings clipped. But since early 2017, I think they got their mojo back. I mean, they reported about how the data the Ministry of Labor had put together in support of Abe's work limits, karoshi countermeasures bill in early 2017 had been doctored, right, and then faked up. They also reported the cover-up about the self-defense forces in Sudan. They also reported about the two crony scandals involving schools. So I think the Asahi has come back, and they are playing a very positive role. And so I think that that's a good thing. Problem is that, you know, the Sankei, you know, Japan, getting back to Japan Times, I think that their editorial line used to be much more close to the Asahi end of the spectrum, and now it's grown closer to the Sankei end of the spectrum. How long has Abe still got in power? Too long. Looks like how much time is left? I don't know.
If you go down the bottom, oh, we've just gotten a new one. Actually, maybe it only came to me, but it's going to be in the last topic, I think. The question is, what will the major political and societal changes in the wake of the virus scenario be?
Yeah, okay. Our next topic was actually to be COVID-19. So yeah, let's jump into it.
Well, who knows what the new post-pandemic norm will be? I certainly don't. I think moving to online teaching is a sign of the times. Things are definitely changing. I think people, you know, travel is going to change dramatically. I mean, people like Amy, who seems to be a big traveler, her wings are clipped. I do a lot of field work. Earlier this year, I'd gone to the Forced Labor Museum in Busan. I'd gone to Sri Lanka to interview people about transitional justice. These are things that I do for various book projects, writing projects I'm doing, and that's going to become a lot more difficult. So I think that, yeah, I think that the pandemic so far has been mostly a public health problem. And I've written a few pieces in which I are very critical of Abe's leadership. And a lot of people say, well, come on, Japan basically dodged the bullet compared to other countries, relatively few deaths. And I'm thinking, that's great. But I don't think Abe can claim any credit whatsoever for that. I mean, you know, it starts back with the Diamond Princess, the digging a deep hole with the botched quarantine, then doubling up with the botched disembarkation. Clearly, Abe was very concerned about three things. He didn't want to have a lot of headlines about the corona outbreak in Japan. And so they're minimizing testing and they're downplaying the risk. And Abe was setting a tone of complacency because he wanted to save the Olympics. He was very concerned about the economy was already tanking, and he wanted to preserve the summit with Xi Jinping that was scheduled in April. So he had three very good reasons to want to downplay the crisis. And the thing is, that meant that he had to dither. And so this is why, you know, overwhelming majority of Japanese people, no matter which poll you look at, think that he waited too long to declare a national emergency, and that he has been very poor at managing the crisis. So I think, you know, there is credit to be given to some politicians, governor of Tokyo, governor of Wakayama, governor of Osaka, governor of Hokkaido. They weren't going to wait for the national government to act because they knew they'd be waiting a very long time, and they had to do things sooner. The other thing is, Japanese people undertook sensible precautions on their own initiative. They also weren't waiting for Abe. So I think it's a very good outcome that Japan's had so far, but we're not out of the woods. You know, remember the Spanish flu, round 1 was relatively mild, round 2 was fierce. So let's not say it's all done yet, but assuming Japan will survive this COVID pandemic in relatively good shape, I don't think Abe can claim, you know, any credit for that. But now it is the economic impact. Everybody knows the typhoon is gathering. People are battening down their hatches. Companies aren't investing. They're not hiring. They're rescinding offers. Households are going to reduce spending to essential things. So this is going to have a sort of downward spiraling implosion. And economic pain, you know, can be, you know, foretold. And Toyota anticipating an 80% drop in profits. Projections that the Chinese economy, the GDP, will shrink by 40%, the American by 30%. So this is going to batter the Japanese economy, and 40% of Japanese people are in non-regular employment, meaning they don't have job security. So things are going to get worse, and the first economic stimulus package was remarkably stingy. I mean, they had the headline 1 trillion figure, but when you sort of dug through that, a lot of that had already been promised spending. And the real problem is all the red tape that stands in between the government's promises and the people who need the money now. So nobody is really giving the Abe team much credit for the economic stimulus package. It seems too little and too late. But you know, imagine you get your 100,000 yen payment for a household. It's a one-off. This isn't income replacement. That's not very much money to last a household for several months. Even if you have 3 household members, 300,000 yen. Small, medium-sized businesses can get unsecured loans of like 2 million yen. Again, that's, you know, drop in the bucket. So in terms of support for those in a vulnerable position, I don't think the economic stimulus package has really done nearly enough. So the jury is out, and hopefully the Abe government will do a lot better in round 2. But that doesn't really get to you, how's this going to change life in society?
I think it's pretty good. Yeah, I think you covered that. Should we just open up for some more questions now, since we're, you know, we're on to 5:15 anyway, and then
I didn't hear your alarm.
Questions. Because I muted my mic. I was lucky that I wasn't talking at that time.
So we can, yes, we can take some more questions. We have one in the discussion. How about the maglev train? Is there any way to stop this incredible waste? I heard one prefecture was trying to stop it.
Well, there doesn't seem to be strong economic reasons to have the maglev train. Given that the government's debt to GDP ratio is the highest in the world, it's going to be climbing dramatically because of the COVID pandemic. I think it's going to be really much more difficult to argue in favor of it, but it's sort of had 9 lives. I mean, there's never been a real strong rationale for that project. Sometimes rational arguments don't prevail. But, you know, never give up hope. Who knows?
All right. So from here, I don't have any more questions in the queue. So if you want to raise your hand or just unmute your mic and speak.
I have a question. Is that okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I'm not sure the proper name of it. The prosecutor's office, the proposition to extend their retirement age. That proposal was criticized even by like Japanese personalities, which really surprised me. That I just thought those kind of people don't criticize politicians. Like, yeah. Anyway, so to me that suggested there was widespread disagree, you know, widespread dissatisfaction with Abe, but to see it actually being voiced by people who weren't politicians really surprised me. So I was wondering how you see that.
Yeah, I think celebrities here walk on thin ice. I remember when Rhoda was on one TV show I was watching, and she was critical about the government's promoting the Heneko base project environmental damage. And Dave Spector just lashed out at her and said, what are you doing? I mean, you're just a talento. Talento aren't supposed to speak about serious matters. You're like, yeah, Dave, you should follow your own advice, right? So in this case, I think there's a petition online that almost 5 million people signed. I mean, I don't think people are against extending retirement for civil servants. I think that they all realize that this legislation was to sort of retroactively legitimize the cabinet's decision to extend the retirement of a friendly prosecutor so that he could be positioned to take over the prosecutor general's position later this year when the current holder retires. So I think it was basically how the Conte has gathered more power over appointments than previous administrations. This is what Australian academic Aurelia George Mulligan, in her book, it's sort of the executive prime ministership, and how this prime minister and his underlings have essentially concentrated power over civil servant appointments in a way that gives them a lot of leverage over organizations that his predecessors never had. And so people see this as an abuse of power and essentially trying to rig the justice system in this way, I think people thought was a bit much. So I am heartened by the fact that celebrities are coming forward and not keeping silent, because they can have enormous influence on public opinion in the way that activists might not be able to. So people, when they see, oh, she's even upset about this. So I think that this resonated with a lot of people. And the thing is, what a self-inflicted wound. And up until past year or so, Team Abe's PR team seemed like Swiss watch. You know, well organized and managing the narratives pretty well. But I mean, you know, how bad can it get? Abe squandered a lot of political capital on getting this legislation through. And then suddenly he withdrew it. And we know now why he withdrew it, because he realized the press had gotten wind that his buddy had gone out gambling on Mahjong with 2 reporters from Sankei and 1 from Asahi. I mean, I don't know, you know, it is actually a crime to gamble for money, but talk about criminal stupidity. I mean, this prosecutor is in the limelight, you know, it's a big scandal. I mean, you think the guy would have more sense, but I guess not. So it does, you know, cast a lot of doubt on Abe's judgment. And apparently this guy is very close to Suga in particular. And Suga has been Abe's pit bull. A lot of people credit Suga actually with keeping the Abe administration in good shape, intimidating opponents. So Suga seems to have also lost his mojo. So I think, you know, right now, Abe is sinking in the polls, but he says it's his duty to take care of the pandemic and to rescue the economy. So I guess he sees this as something he's got to soldier on. But he's not going to have a friendly prosecutor. Now, all these scandals have come to light again. You know, the widow of the Ministry of Finance official who committed suicide over shredding of and altering documents submitted to the Diet related to the land sale. That letter has been released. We found out that the list of invitees to the Cherry Blossom Party was shredded. So Abe is lurching from scandal to scandal. And, you know, you look at the NHK monthly polls, They say 15% think highly of his leadership, 15% value his policies. But the reason why people support Abe, if they support him, is because half of them say there's nobody else. So he's been very fortunate not having any really serious rivals in his party, and the opposition has been fractured. But I think that probably now there's some maneuvering in the back rooms, figuring, well, let Abe take the blame for this, and then who's next?
Thank you.
All right. Anybody else? I don't see any hands
Yeah,
raised. Or,
I've got a question.
go ahead.
It's about what seems to be the deeply conservative nature of Japanese society. How come there's no decent opposition? When I came to Japan, there was Doi Takako and Murayama, and at least some semblance of a social democratic party. There seems to be nothing now. The Communist Party doesn't seem to, it's very active in the area where I live around here, but it doesn't seem to be gaining as an opposition force. There's no Green Party that I'm aware of. How come the LDP keep getting voted back in? Is it just natural conservatism of Japanese?
Well, I guess all depends who you talk to, but think about it. Half the Japanese people who could vote don't vote. And the LDP typically wins about half of the half that do vote. So it's not an overwhelming mandate. They get about a quarter of the eligible vote. But they do win, and they do fill the diet with LDP supporters. So they win as far as the system is, but I wouldn't say that that's an accurate barometer of Japanese sentiments. And also the coalition partner, Komeito, is a very formidable voting machine. And on many policies, social policies in particular, I think the Komeito is quite different than the LDP, more progressive. I think they also are opponents of revising Article 9 and have made that very clear to Abe. So when you look at his coalition controls 2/3 of the seats in the upper and lower house, not if Komeito decides against that. So you're right, the opposition is extremely weak, but the problem is the electoral districts are drawn such that rural areas are heavily overrepresented compared to urban areas. And this plays to the strengths of the LDP. Generally speaking, urban areas are where you have more progressive voters. So the underrepresentation of urban voters, overrepresentation of rural areas, I think also skews the system. In America, we call it sort of gerrymandering, that type of thing. And the Supreme Court has a number of times said that this system is in a state of unconstitutionality, but stops short of actually invalidating results. So there have been modest revisions and tweakings to just barely abide by Supreme Court guidelines, but clearly the system is still biased. Now, the fracturing of the opposition happened after the DPJ switched to power in 2009. That essentially was a repudiation of the LDP's neoliberal policies. That suddenly people post-Lehman shock woke up to, oh, it's easy for companies to dismiss workers. About 250,000 workers suddenly were out on the street, literally because they were kicked out of their company dorms, and there was no safety net in place. So there we were, Oshogatsu 2009, and we're looking at all of these displaced people, the soup kitchen in Hibiya Park across from the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare. And that, I think, turned the tide. And of course, then you had a few LDP grandees saying, oh, these lazy bums, if they get off their butt, take responsibility for yourself. And so that, I think, led to a backlash against the LDP, the DPJ rode to power. So it was a rainbow coalition of different interests. A lot of people in the DPJ were fairly conservative, people that had just basically left the LDP for various reasons, and socialist and union members. So it was sort of a broad coalition. And when Hatoyama came to power, we found out through WikiLeaks that the Japanese government officials were coaching the Americans how to discredit Hatoyama over his opposition to the Okinawan bases and to relocate them somewhere else. A lot of countries, that's sort of, I don't know, borderline treason or whatever. But anyway, so, you know, Hatoyama was brought to earth. And then we had Naoto Kan, and for various reasons, his popularity declined. Then we had 3/11. And he, you know, had been a supporter of nuclear energy. And then he did total, you know, flip-flop. And he said, wow, you know, this country can't, you know, have nuclear power. And he jawboned the Chubu utility into shutting the Hamaoka plant, which is near the Nankai Trough, right? So the DPJ at that point had sort of understood the public's anxieties about nuclear power, and under Kan, they introduced the two-step stress test so that by May 2012, all of Japan's reactors were offline, right? And there was no great emergency in Japan. But his successor, you know, he decided to bring a few reactors back online. He also reversed a cabinet decision to basically wean Japan off of nuclear power under heavy pressure from the Japanese business community, but also it turns out the United States didn't want Japan to stop nuclear power because that would raise questions about Japan's stockpile of plutonium. So be it as it may, any of the goodwill that the DPJ had with the public because of its anti-nuclear stance evaporated under Noda. And so when they went into an election that many people anticipated would be a referendum on nuclear power, Ishihara, the governor of Tokyo at the time, you know, changed the channel. He decided he would nationalize, purchase the Senkaku Islands from the owner, and then created a huge diplomatic row with China, as his ambassador to China had predicted, telling him you shouldn't do this. And so this then raised security tensions with China. And so the election, which was expected to be about nuclear power, which would favor the DPJ since all 54 reactors were built on the LDP's watch. So suddenly it's all about national security. And the LDP definitely has a lock on national security. The DPJ were seen as the B team. And, you know, they elected the LDP. And Abe, when they had presidential elections, he was the only candidate to come out saying, I'm pro-nuclear. Right? So he, you know, was elected as president, and the LDP won, and not happily ever after.
Right. Thank you. Any other questions? We're actually right on time that we're supposed to finish. So if there's no last question, that's my job to tie things up by thanking Jeff for that wonderful talk. Very impressed by the fluency with which you talked for so long and answered those questions in such depth. Very impressive indeed. Thank you very much for your time and input.
Nice to be here. Thank you for your questions. Patiently
And, thanks also very much to Amy for the interview questions, and thanks to Lisa for running this. It's been an experimental episode for us, but I think we can see ways that we can use Zoom in future. We'll have to get together and discuss that. But thanks a lot, Jeff. We really appreciate it.
I'm glad I reduced my carbon footprint, you know, so
Yes,
I guess our future of limited travel.
yes, there are
Thank you, Jeff.
benefits, aren't there? Corona,
Right.
Corona wasn't all bad.
Okay, well, anyway, I will repair and toast all of you and your good health during the pandemic. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Nice
Thank
to
Thank
meet
you so
all.
much.
Okay, all right, Lisa, we can all check out.
We can. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Over and out. Thank you,
Bye-bye,
everyone.
Australia.
Thank you. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
Nice way to get together, isn't it?
Yes.
Scotland,
Absolutely.
Australia, Japan,
Yeah.
Kyoto, Seto Naikai.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。
はい、どうぞどうぞ。
はい、どうぞ。
はい。
どうぞありがとうございました。
バイバイ。
Bye.
Bye.
また。
Until next time.
All right, bye-bye.
どうぞ。
うん